You mentioned something earlier, Rev, during the break.
Well, and it was going back to your last segment, and you're talking about the big sort. And really, in a way, Americans segregating themselves by virtue of, in this case, geography. They're moving to certain areas because they want to be around people that think the way they do. Mm-hmm. And I asked you during the break, I said, well, it sounds like you're saying that the big sort has already begun.
I don't think there's any question. I think the big sort is well underway. And I think because of the big sort, and I'll let Dr. Kaufman jump in here, I think because of the big sort, the job the federal government has is almost impossible.
You're saying basically America's too big, or the population is too large?
Think of this.
Too many diverse ideas?
Okay, when you think of conservatism, and I'm not saying conservatives monopolize this. That's certainly an insult to liberals. Not that I'm offended by insulting liberals, but faith, family, hard work, traditional values. I mean, those are kind of core issues for Republican voters. And then you've got diversity, social justice, income inequality, feminism, humanism, redistributionism. So if you've got these two parties who believe in vastly different things, and you've got a country that reflects the values of these two parties, and I think Dr. Kaufman would agree. I'm not saying we're divided square in the middle. I'm not saying there are just as many people who believe in the Republican creed as there are just as many people who believe in the Democrat mantra. But, Scott, what I'm arguing is we're asking the federal government to do things and govern in a way that is absolutely impossible because we have become so complex, so populated, so diverse, so detached and not respectful of one another's opinions. And I used the example this morning. Why should Ted Cruz be able to hold the city of San Francisco hostage? And why should Nancy Pelosi be able to hold the city of Greenville, South Carolina hostage? And it really began, I mean, obviously it began, and I'd love to hear Dr. Kaufman's take on this. It really began after the Civil War when we had to centralize. We had to reestablish the Union. And I think Lincoln deserves a lot of credit in allowing the federal government to do things that it probably had to do at that particular time. And then we had the Great Depression, the New Deal, government intervention, kind of got on steroids. And I think since then, Scott, we've looked at the federal government to solve the problems that all Americans face. And because of our complexities and diversities and enormousness, it's become almost impossible to govern in a central planning kind of way.
Well, there's a lot here to talk about. The first, I listened to the show as I was coming here today, and one of the things I thought about is you're a big fan of Thomas Jefferson.
I am.
James Madison was a Jeffersonian. James Madison, I think, would be very surprised by what you're saying, because it was James Madison who argued that a large country was a good thing, because the larger the country is, the more factions you have, and the more difficult it is for one faction to dominate over another. Now, granted, Madison did not foresee the development of a two-party system. What he would have preferred was a multi-party system.
Bingo.
Where you would have numerous groups having to work with one another and develop coalitions. So one thing I'd point out right there is that, again, I think Madison would be somewhat surprised what you're saying, but at the same time understand, I think, given the realities of today. As for the growing strength of the central government, don't forget that we actually saw pulling back from the power of the central government during the period of Reconstruction. After Reconstruction, I should say. Rutherford B. Hayes comes in and says, let's end the military occupation of the South. Let's kind of go back to kind of the way things were, aside from, slavery is illegal, but was much less willing to have a strong central government like the kind we saw under Lincoln. We really begin seeing the strengthening once again of the central government under McKinley. President William McKinley is seen as the first modern president, the one who really began to use the power of the presidency to develop a Republican base, or in this case, a party base, make that the central government more stronger. And then Theodore Roosevelt builds on that with progressivism. And it is the progressive idea that Franklin Roosevelt builds the New Deal on. So really what we're talking about here is a process that began prior to the New Deal, even prior to Theodore Roosevelt.
Do you believe the Constitution intended for the country to be governed in a federalist kind of way? You mentioned Madison. When you read a lot of the Federalist Papers, do you believe the Constitution intended the creation of our country for it to be governed in a federalist kind of way? And do you believe we've governed ourselves in that manner?
Well, there's the issue right there. You were talking about the 10th Amendment. All powers not explicitly delegated to the federal government are given to the states or the people thereof.
Would you agree that that is a federalist policy?
Well, I would be looking more at Article 1, Section 8, if you want to talk about power of the federal government. The necessary and proper clause, which says that Congress shall have the power to enact those laws.
That's where you
necessary and
liberals
proper.
always go. That's where you always go.
Well, but here's the issue. Here's the issue. When you're talking about giving the states more power, number one, you're going to have to go ahead and figure out what to do about Article 1, Section 8. Is that going to require a revision of the Constitution itself? Do we need a constitutional convention? Are you talking about going back to the Articles of Confederation, in which the states had supremacy and the federal government was weak? If you're talking about that, then you're going to run into all kinds of issues, all kinds of serious problems the Founding Fathers themselves noted. So where do you find that balance between the power of the federal government and the power of the states?
Okay, and this isn't confrontational at all. What do you think the founders intended with the 10th Amendment? What do you think his original intent was?
That's
because it's to me, it's fairly clearly articulated that they wanted, not all of those, but the Jeffersonians of the bunch.
Okay.
That they wanted, and I know this is where you were going. All of them didn't want that. The Hamiltonians didn't want that. The Jeffersonians did. But it is an amendment. I mean, we did amend the Constitution to include the 10th Amendment.
Well, but of course, you'd ask the same question about what do the Founding Fathers mean by the Second Amendment with regard to the right to bear arms? Did they mean a militia, in that case, the National Guard and maybe the police?
So your interpretation of the 10th Amendment is what?
Well, that's where I have the issue. If you look at the 10th Amendment strictly, then you could make the argument, I think, and this is exactly what the strict constructionists argue, is that if the federal government cannot explicitly do it, then the states or the people thereof are the ones who have that power. But the problem I have here is when people say this is what the Founding Fathers intended.
Now, the Founding Fathers had a lot of different intent, a lot of different beliefs.
Exactly, because the Hamiltonians would say, wait a minute here. If you have a system where the states have a significant amount of power, then you potentially run into a problem similar to what you have the Articles of Confederation. The Hamiltonians argued you needed a strong central government to bring the people together, to develop a sense of community, so that way this experiment in republicanism, small r, could work. Okay,
let's leave there and go here for a second. If we agree that the great debate of our early ages were Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians, did we ever envision a central planner having the sort of authority it has? Even the Hamiltonians, when you talk about the Jeffersonians really wanted states to have the right to direct and dictate their future. The Hamiltonians wanted a more powerful central planner. And at the time, I can understand some argument there. Central banks, we had to have credit with other countries. We're a fledgling baby of a nation. I get that. I mean, I think there's some merit to the early days of Hamiltonianism, if that's such a word. But when you look at the big sort, as the Rev and I were talking about this morning, the complexities of America, the diversity of America, the enormity of America. It's a huge country, Scott, with 325 or 30 million people, and you and I agree it's fairly deeply divided. Did even the most staunch Hamiltonian believe that as America grew, as it became more diverse, more complicated, that a central planner could govern effectively and efficiently?
Well, I think the Hamiltonians would have said that it can. But we also have to keep in mind that these are individuals who lived in very different times.
The population of the country was what?
Few million.
Yeah, 3 or 4 or 5 million people.
Women couldn't vote. African Americans couldn't vote. The country was much smaller geographically, demographically. We were not a world power like we are today. There are so many, technology has changed, made a huge difference as well. There are many things they couldn't foresee, which of course is why they also said you should be able to amend the Constitution to address these issues. This is why it's argued the Constitution is a living document, because it can be changed, it can be amended. But certainly they were not people who could see into the future and know what this country was going to be like 100 years or 200 years from now. Certainly, if we look at the Madisonians, the Jeffersonians, what they were hoping for was a multi-party system where you would not have one party being able to dictate to the other or vice versa. Did they foresee gerrymandering? I doubt it. Did they foresee Citizens United? I doubt it. So again, a lot of things here that I think even the founding fathers, not all of them, but maybe many of them would say, wait a minute here, this is not what we intended.
But do you agree or not that the country has become so diverse, so complicated? And I don't say that in a negative sense. I mean, I think diversity and complication is probably a good thing when you're the melting pot that is the United States of America. But do you believe the job of governing the country under one federal authority has become too much to ask of our federal government? That's the argument I'm making. I don't know if they're bad. I'm sure they're bad people. I'm sure there are good people. You'll encounter bad people and good people today. The government's full of imperfect people because we are who we are. But having said that, I'm arguing that because of the complication, because of the enormity, 330 million people instead of 3 million people, that we're asking the federal government to do things that it was never intended to do. And that's why the American public are so frustrated with the inability to effectively govern a very complicated, diverse, and big nation.
We were at the gym a few weeks ago. We were walking around the track, and you asked me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you asked me if our political system is broken.
Correct.
And I said I don't think it's broken, but it's in need of repair. I think that one of the reasons why Americans are a few reasons why Americans are upset. We've talked about them on this show. But there are a couple of things here that I think would help. Number one, get rid of gerrymandering. I think that is part of the problem, because if you have a district, for instance, where you know it's going to be Republican, then you're going to see Republicans against each other saying who's the most Republican, who's the most conservative. And that can push that district further and further to the right. This is something that Dr. Thigpen has talked about. Same with the Democrats, who is more liberal, and that could push that district more and more to the left. Second of all, Citizens United has got to be gotten rid of. That is not something I think the founding fathers intended, was to have these large PACs be able to pretty much determine the debate. I think also it would help if we forced political candidates, particularly those running for president, to have to rely on federal campaign funds, federal funding.
So you're for public financing of campaigns?
Yes, to restrict how much money they have available. I would even be in favor of restricting how long the campaign could be.
How do you square that up with believing the First Amendment?
That is where we would have to have some...
Because I'm not far from you. I mean, I believe that we've got to revisit the way we finance and fund campaigns.
Right.
But the First Amendment gives you, and in Citizens United, we know this. I mean, they deemed basically a corporation as a person. Mm-hmm. John Roberts basically said corporations are people indeed, and that's why he ruled in the affirmative. Mm-hmm. But having said that, how do you revisit campaign finance in a way that is constitutional in regards to the First Amendment?
Well, that's going to be an issue.
Are you willing to be unconstitutional?
Well, it depends how you define what constitutional is. One of the big debates we've had about the Bill of Rights is, are the rights in the Bill of Rights absolute? I don't have the right to slander somebody, to libel somebody, even though I believe it's my right under free speech or freedom of the press. So there's clearly restrictions. I can't yell fire in a crowded theater and cause a mass panic. I can't own and go out and I can't carry around a bazooka. I mean, even the federal government says there are restrictions on the right to bear arms. So they're not absolute. It's how they're defined that becomes the issue within that realm of how absolute they are.
But today the court has defined,
exactly,
Citizens United, that political contributions are reflective of the First Amendment. Mm-hmm.